Well, my topic this morning is beloved community, and I'm going to begin with a definition. Our one Unitarian Universalist website I looked at defines beloved community as what happens when people of diverse racial, ethnic, educational, class, abilities, and/or gender identities come together in an interdependent relationship of love, justice, mutual respect, and care. Widely diverse people coming together in a relationship of love, justice, mutual respect, and care. That's a long definition, and it can get complicated. People from different backgrounds and different experiences see and feel things differently. We may love and care for someone very different from ourselves, but that alone does not create justice or even mutual respect, not by itself. Here's an example. Many years ago, not long after I started my ministry in Columbus, Indiana, Columbus East High School had a big controversy over doing To Kill a Mockingbird as their school play. And they were into rehearsals when parents of Black cast members objected, they said, to what some people call the N-bomb in the script. The play's publisher would not allow the script to be changed. The Columbus chapter of the NAACP stepped in and the performance wound up being canceled. By that time, pretty much everyone involved was angry at everyone else involved, and not without justification. It was a very complex and unfortunate situation. A few years later, I preached a sermon about the film version of To Kill a Mockingbird. It is on one level a fine movie, but it is also a perfect example of how a movie or a play or a person can be anti-racist as an ideal while reinforcing structural racism in practice. Author Harper Lee's book, the play, and also the movie did call attention to racial injustice in the Deep South. At the same time, none of them portrayed the story's Black characters as real human beings. As film critic Roger Ebert put it, Black characters are no more than props in a story about a brave white liberal, close quote. In the movie's climactic courtroom scene, Black handyman Tom Robinson has been unjustly accused of assaulting a white woman. Atticus Finch, the noble white lawyer in the story, cross-examines the woman and proves beyond a doubt that Tom Robinson is innocent, but the all-white jury convict him anyway. But here's the problem. Despite this grievous injustice, there is no outrage from the Black community members sitting in the courtroom's balcony. There's not even grief for their neighbor and brother convicted of a crime he did not commit. Instead, they all stand in silent respect to honor the white lawyer, Atticus Finch. And later, when the sheriff shoots and kills Tom Robinson, Atticus Finch meekly accepts that getting killed was Tom Robinson's own fault. And with the murder of George Floyd, I think we can all see the problem with that plot device. Years later, Harper Lee's estate posthumously published an earlier version of To Kill a Mockingbird titled Go Set a Watchman. And many people were shocked to see Atticus Finch depicted as deeply racist in that book. But what we really see is a great writer shaped within 1950s structural racism, if you will, struggling to create a non-racist character. It took her 2 books to do it, and she never totally succeeded. But the racial insensitivity in both stories is real. But even when I preached on the movie, I struggled to explain the racism because the vocabulary to explain it hadn't yet been invented. Black Film director Spike Lee later coined the term magical Negro for characters like Tom Robinson. They have no reality other than to help build a story about the white heroes. Meanwhile, Atticus Finch is what's now called a white savior. The blacks in the story can't help themselves, so a noble white person helps them. Magical Negroes and white saviors are now recognized as racist cliches. And that was part of what Columbus's Black community were picking up on in the early 2000s with that East High School play. But the vocabulary to even describe what was going on didn't yet exist. We're still figuring this stuff out. So no wonder there was a misunderstanding and hurt feelings on all sides. The writers and the high school had the best intentions, but good intentions alone do not create mutual respect or justice. And blaming an innocent Tom Robinson for his own death is just one stark example. Or to put it differently, here's a thought experiment. What if, when Tom Robinson was arrested, the town's Black citizens had contacted the NAACP for support? The novel is set in the mid-1930s, just when future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall was starting out as a Black civil rights lawyer for the NAACP. So, what if a character based on Thurgood Marshall came to Alabama to be Tom Robinson's lawyer, maybe with Atticus Finch as his assistant? You would sure have a different story from the one that Harper Lee wrote. The power dynamics would be totally different. But Harper Lee gives no sign that she had ever even heard of Thurgood Marshall when she was writing that book. It's not that she didn't have the best possible intentions. Okay, fast forward to the Unitarian Universalist Association, spring of 2017. The UUA Southern Region lead executive was retiring. The UUA personnel director interviewed several possible replacements, men, women, people of color, and he then hired a white male minister that he already knew, who did not even live in the Southern region and who had no intention of relocating. And in so doing, he passed over women and people of color who did live in the Southern region. Now, I know the minister who got picked, and he would have done a great job. I know some of the other candidates as well, and several of them would also have done a great job. And in fact, one of the passed over applicants now does lead this UUA region. The evidence suggests that the personnel director had made his choice before he even began the interviews, and that's not unusual in hiring. Unitarian Universalist professionals of color, though, had been talking about this problem for years. UUA hiring was weighted toward white men. One applicant of color told again that a white male was just a better fit, went public in an outraged blog post, and I think the functional term would be boom. Because at that same time, UU professionals of color just happened to be gathered on retreat, and it would take an hour or more to recite all the details. Suffice to say, outrage exploded, and then washed into social media. The personnel director, UUA president, and UUA vice president all wound up resigning, along with other top-level leadership. And the UUA has been working to try to figure out what went wrong and how to fix it ever since. There were good intentions on everyone's part, but good intent alone does not create mutual respect or justice. It just felt safer and easier for the personnel director to hire a white male minister he already knew and liked, rather than take a chance on a woman or person of color he didn't know as well. There were diversity goals in place, but he put that goal off just this one more time. And that is exactly how white supremacy culture works. Folks who look like me just doing what seems easiest and most practical in the moment. And of course, in this case, it blew up what we now realize was a flawed system. And so for the record, I really appreciate the steps our UUA has been trying to take ever since. And part of this includes a hard look at our 7 principles. We've had them almost 40 years now, and they are full of good intentions. But even before the 2017 hiring fiasco, people were starting to wonder whether the 7 principles by themselves were enough. Maybe we needed something more accountability, less theory. The hard part, of course, is finding consensus about what something more ought to look like in practice. One possibility is the proposed 8th principle. Also, two summers ago, General Assembly, our national convention, voted to form a commission to study all of Article 2, which is the part of our UUA bylaws that states our purposes and principles. And a few weeks ago, you may have heard about this, or this may be the first time, they submitted a total rewrite of Article 2, completely replacing the 7 principles. And I'll get back to that. Meanwhile, since 2017, there's been hard pushback from a few folks against any real change. And of course, me being me, I jumped into that conversation 2 years ago and wrote a whole book, and I brought a copy here, on how easy it is for a straight, white, relatively able male such as myself to misunderstand challenges faced by marginalized identities. I worked really hard on this book, and I called it Clueless: My Education in White Supremacy. And I passed it around to colleagues and associates for comment. White colleagues who read it mostly loved it, but colleagues of color were less enthusiastic. And I finally just came out and asked what's going on with it. And I was told, well, Dennis, your good intentions are obvious, but you're still mainlining your own white male experience. You're telling us what marginalization feels like to an able, straight, white man. It doesn't speak to our actual lived experience. In other words, really, I had done the same thing that I had criticized To Kill a Mockingbird for doing. And I'm now working on a whole different approach from an angle where my own viewpoint is less central. And I think this is really important work for me to be doing. But one reason I'm telling this story is that there have been other times I've been called out for similar mistakes, sometimes big ones. If we engage racial justice issues, gender justice, or issues around ableism with the people who live those issues every day, people like me are going to make mistakes. And I can tell you that when you work hard and sincerely try and still find out you goofed, it can really sting. It's embarrassing. In the case of my book, Clueless, it really took the wind out of my sails. It took me a good year to figure out a different approach and get back into my writing stride. But I'm still glad. And I think that in the end, I will write something better because I did listen to that feedback. I believe that courage, resilience, stick-to-itiveness, and the willingness to be uncomfortable, to make a mistake, to get disappointed, and then get up and get back after justice work. Those are, to me, important pieces of my liberal religious practice. It's really easy to say we believe something, or to say we don't believe something. We're really good at that. But I can tell you from my own experience, the most difficult thing of all may just be to put our own egos at risk, to actually listen to the lived experience and opinions of marginalized people we claim to want to help, to admit that people like me still have much to learn from people outside the dominant culture mainstream. And for the record, that is where the eighth principle comes in. And that's where the new Article 2 rewrite comes in. Change is difficult, particularly to change something we've come to take for granted, like the seven principles. And really, our approach to social justice for 30 years after we approved the principles. But here's an example of the way change works. When it was first published in 1611, the King James Bible was hated by English Christians. The Puritans particularly detested it. They said it was sacrilegious. They wanted to keep their own translation called the Geneva Bible. 400 years later, of course, Christian conservatives now consider the King James the only Bible worth reading. And I've even talked to some folks who don't even know it's a translation. They think that's what the apostles actually wrote. I'm serious. Let us not do that with our seven principles. Unitarian Universalists are a proudly non-creedal religious tradition. We have religious values. We make religious promises, covenants about how we want to relate to one another and to the world. That's basically what the seven principles are. But from our beginnings, we have never, ever tried to set our ideals in unchanging stone. We keep finding different ways to express them as we learn more about the world. I often say, if we ever are afraid to change our seven principles or revise them or do away with them entirely, we start down that road, making them into an unchangeable sacred creed. And our association's bylaws actually require that we revisit our seven principles and purposes every few years. For the record, there have been a few suggested changes over the years, but nothing major got voted in. Now, this year's Article 2 rewrite, the seven principles are gone. Here's a copy. There's a couple floating around out in the fellowship hall. You can read them after the service. But here's what it looks like. 3 sides of paper. The seven principles are gone. The 6 sources are gone. In their place, the study commission suggests 7 values, and the draft shows them in this diagram here. Probably hard to see from there, but it's justice, generosity, evolution, equity, pluralism, and interdependence, all in a circle around love as the central value. Now, if you don't start and finish your day every day by checking what's going on behind the scenes at the Unitarian Universalist Association, this may be a surprise. After all, we've been talking about a proposed 8th principle, and now here's this draft with no principles at all. But again, this process has actually been in the works for a couple of years. And I believe, and again, here's the draft. I believe we need to approach this draft really as a think piece to stimulate conversation about our ideals and our mission. It's not going to get passed as written, and I don't think it's really meant to. And it certainly is tempting to look at it and go, eek, what are they doing to our 7 principles? But we need to relax and remember there have already been hundreds of suggestions how this needs to be changed and revised and rephrased. There are going to be lots more. So for now, I just invite folks to look at it when you get a minute and think it over. And if you have strong feelings, maybe get in on the feedback process. In the first round of congregational feedback just finished, one thing has already changed. The commission kind of took democratic process for granted, so the draft doesn't specifically mention that. That's being put back in, and the commission will submit a revised draft in January, and then each UUA region, we're in the Mid-America region, will then workshop amendments in regional forums, and there will then be a mini assembly in May to further workshop it. And that's all before our next assembly, General Assembly, gets their hands on it in late June. In other words, conversation, debate, and wordsmithing are going to be hot and heavy for the next 6 months. Really, it's classic Unitarian Universalist democratic process. Think of the racket the kids were making with all the different noise. That's where we are. I predict that this version that comes out of this summer's General Assembly, if it does come out, will be very different from this one. They may keep these 7 values, but I wouldn't even bet big money on that. Then another year will go by and it has to be passed by, I believe, 3/4 of the delegates in 2024 to actually change what we have now. So I don't know what'll happen. I do think this is a good thing, what we're trying to do. Our whole society, what we've learned about one another, has evolved a lot since the 1980s. Just as a side note, when the 7 principles were approved, Ronald Reagan was president, and we thought he was a conservative. And now half of Republicans will tell you that he's a liberal. We've changed a lot. How should we change to match that or to complement it? How can we be better? Maybe we will just pass a version of the 8th principle and drop the total rewrite. That's still on the table. That can still happen that way. I think what the UUA is trying to do here is unleash the creativity of members nationwide. And when you fire up creativity on that scale, there is no predicting where it may lead. This process is about invitation and stimulation. There is no certain destination. 150 years ago, someone asked legendary Unitarian minister Thomas Starr King where his church stood on an important issue of that day. And Reverend King responded, "We don't stand, we move." 150 years later, yeah, we're still moving. Or for a better word, we're still evolving. And I too feel a little nervous, a little excited, and definitely curious about how we evolve next. I hope you do too. Amen. May it be so.